All right, I've got a very serious problem here. I think something's very seriously wrong with me. For the last 6 years straight, I've been eating as much food as I can possibly stomach, which means 4,000 to 5,000 calories every single day, and I cannot gain any significant amount of fat. All right, some people would call that a blessing. Maybe it's a curse, I don't know. That's what we're going to talk about in this video. We're going to open up the discussion about this because I want to hear what your experience has been and I want to share mine. So if you're new to this channel, my name's Jacob. And if you don't know my story, back in 2017, I had my health completely destroyed, seemingly out of the blue. And after being failed by the medical industry and basically being on the brink of death for over a year, I took matters into my own hands. And after tons of experimentation, trying diet after diet, and essentially treating myself like a lab rat, I ended up finding some stuff that worked. And after that very, very difficult experience, coming out clean on the other side, I made it my personal mission to share everything I've learned to help people out so that they can achieve a life of fulfillment, health, and purpose. So to kick this off, I'm going to talk about what I used to eat back before I got sick and what my body composition looked like then versus what I eat now and what my body composition looks like present day. And then I'm also going to talk about why I think I've seen the results I've seen and why I think this might work for some people and for other people it might not. And then at the end of this video, I'm going to share my thoughts about the calorie because I can't talk about these topics and talk about food and nutrition without talking about calories, which is something I have very strong opinions about. And hopefully this video kind of helps to explain why I have those opinions. All right, so to dive right into this, I'm going to take you back in time a little bit. I'm going to take you back prior to 2017 before I got sick. All right, so growing up, I was always a very, very skinny kid. In 2005, coming out of college, I was 145 pounds and I'm 6'1". All right, so I was very, very skinny. And it's always been really hard for me to gain weight. But in 2005, something clicked and I was like, you know what? I want to start lifting weights. I want to put on some muscle. So that's what I did. I set a goal for myself to hit 200 pounds. And in order for me to do that, I had to eat a lot more food than I was used to. And that meant me eating, 5 to 7 times a day. And probably back then I was consuming roughly 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day. But over the period of several years, I hit that goal. And through that process, I put on a lot of muscle, but I also gained some fat. And I would say that when I was 200 pounds, I was probably somewhere around 20% body fat, which throughout my childhood, I was very, very skinny. I had very low body fat. So for me, that was actually quite a bit more body fat than what I was used to. But when I got to that point, it still wasn't good enough. I still wasn't big enough and I had to put on more muscle. So I started powerlifting. And when I started powerlifting, I bumped up the amount of calories I was consuming, the amount of food I was eating, and I bumped up the amount of meals I was eating. Because if you're going to lift very, very heavy weight, you have to fuel your body. I started eating 7 to 9 times a day, and I bumped my calories up to 4,000 to 5,000 calories every single day. And that took me from being stalled out at 200 for a year or two to 230 in just a couple years. Now, when I hit 230, I got a lot stronger, and I was lifting very, very heavy weight. But I also gained quite a bit more body fat. At the time, I think I was somewhere around 35%, which for me is pretty darn high body fat because I was used to being very, very skinny. All right, so I did gain quite a bit of muscle and I gained quite a bit of weight. My main focus back then was eating very high carbohydrates and very high protein. I bought into the low fat narrative, and the only place I got fats from was nuts, nut butter, and whole milk, and some eggs and stuff like that on occasion. But aside from that, I was eating very lean meats. I was eating, skinless chicken breasts, buying the leanest cuts of red meat I could possibly buy. And I was eating tons of carbs, mostly in the form of whole grains, rice, oatmeal, sweet potatoes. I would eat, those are tubers, but I would eat sweet potatoes. I would eat whole grain cereal and whole grain bread. And overall, I was eating very, very healthy. It was just very high carbohydrates. So fast forward to present day, and I'm now 170 pounds and roughly about 12 to 15% body fat year round. And year round, every single day, I eat 4,000 to 5,000 calories every single day. So the same amount of food, yet somehow, miraculously, I do not gain fat. I simply don't. And, I actually did a 30-day series on my channel, which I'll link below. And in that 30-day series, I tracked what I eat every single day. And you'll see that on average, I eat 4,000 to 5,000 calories every single day. And the crazy thing about this is that the very last video on day 30, I did a full recap of the entire month. And in that recap, I went over the total amount of calories I consumed for the month, if I had gained or lost weight, and all this stuff. So by the end of that month, I consumed over 118,000 calories. All right, so what exactly does that mean? Let's break this down. So in the app I was using, Chronometer, you can actually set up your target goals in there. You can set up goals. You can set up like how much, if you want to gain weight, if you want to lose weight, you can set up all these things. So my goal in there was to gain 1 pound of weight per week. All right. So when I put that information in there, as well as how active I am, my height, weight, and all this stuff, it kind of spits a number out and tells you here's how much calories you need to be consuming to gain a pound of weight a week. And I can't remember exactly what the number was, but I think it was like 2,600 or 2,800 calories. Okay. Now the wild thing is that by the end of that month, on day 30, I had consumed 40,000 calories over what it had recommended for me to consume to gain 1 pound a week. And in doing that, I lost 2 pounds over the course of that month. All right. So instead of gaining weight, I lost 2 pounds, consuming over 40,000 calories above what I was supposed to be consuming. So as you can see, based off my experience, calories to me have been pretty darn irrelevant. And it doesn't really matter so much the amount of calories I consume, but more the food I consume. And I think that's really worth noting. So let's just dive into why I think this is happening. All right. So I think there's actually a few reasons for this. And one of the primary reasons I think is because my health overall has been completely optimized since going carnivore. So back in the day, prior to 2017, I used to get sick all the time with cold, sinus infections, bronchitis, upper respiratory infections. I mean, the winter months for me, they absolutely sucked. All right, I would get sick, this is no joke, every 2 weeks. Like I would get sick, I would get a cold, I would recover from it after a few weeks. And then 2 weeks later, I would catch another cold just like that every single time for the entire winter season. And that happened every single year. And, you know, since going carnivore, I've gotten sick maybe 4 times the entire 6 years I've been carnivore, which that would have been a year for me back then. I mean, I would get sick on average probably 4 to 6 times a year. And I mean, now my immune function, all that stuff is completely optimized. I can't even describe how much better my health is overall, which I mean, obviously it's a lot better because I overcame all that chronic stuff I was also dealing with. But I mean, beyond that, my metabolic function is also improved. I think that also plays a role in why I probably don't really gain fat. You know, my metabolic rate's probably a lot higher. I don't think it's going to be high enough to where I'm burning off 2,000 extra calories every single day, but it's definitely improved overall. And I can say that back then my metabolic rate, well, I don't know, because back then my metabolic rate was pretty darn high because I got starving hungry every 2 hours and I was eating, 7 to 9 times a day. And literally every 2 hours I was downing food, like almost entire meals, because I was starving and I was eating a lot of food. So when it comes to metabolic health, it's really hard to tell how much more my metabolic rate has improved. But I can tell you that overall, my health has improved drastically, and I'm sure that plays a huge role in that. And something else that is drastically improved is my hormone function. So Kelsey, who you might be familiar with if you watched any of my previous videos, she actually is going through menopause right now at the age of 36. And the reason for that is because a few years ago, she had to have a hysterectomy due to endometriosis. All right, so prior to going into menopause, she was eating a carnivore diet. And for the first 2 years, she was able to maintain a very lean body mass without really trying. And she ate pretty much whatever she wanted, just like I do. Now, since starting menopause, she has a much harder time maintaining that lean body mass, eating the same amount of food. She hasn't changed anything about her diet, but it's harder for her. So I think that's very telling in the fact that hormones do actually play a role. And I would say that hormones are one of the most important things in metabolic health, because if your hormones are out of whack, everything about your body is going to be out of whack. And I can tell you that back before I got sick, I had a lot of hormonal issues. All right, I won't go into details on this, but I had libido problems and a lot of really bad stuff going on. And since going carnivore, again, all that stuff has been totally resolved and my hormone function is completely optimized. I simply don't have any of the problems that I used to have. And above that, I think one of the primary things and one of the most important things out of all this is the food I'm actually consuming. Back then, I was eating very high carbohydrates. I was also eating some processed and hyper-processed food because I would have cheat meals and stuff like that on the weekends. And when I would do my cheat meals, I went ham on my cheat meals. All right. I did a lot of food. I mean, I would do like The Rock and I was stacking up like stacks of pancakes. I was doing maple syrup on there. I remember one time I ate 2 large pizzas almost in a single sitting, okay? Because I was trying to bulk up. And to bulk up, you got to eat a ton of food. And, I was strict throughout the week. I ate oatmeal, rice, lean meats, and veggies and fruits and stuff like that through the week. And my weekends were my time to just go crazy and reward myself for being so strict. And that's what I did. So I was eating hyper-processed food occasionally on the weekends. And I was also eating grains and stuff like that, which just in general, if you're getting from big industry, they're full of a lot of bad stuff. There's glyphosate, atrazine, pesticides, herbicides, antibiologics. They're nutrient void. There are phytochemicals in there. Just a lot of stuff that's really not great for your overall health. And I think a lot of those things played an impact on my health being deteriorated overall. And probably, just eating very high carb and eating these hyper-processed foods, which do affect your body in a very different way, allowed me to gain all the weight that I gained. Now that I've cut all that stuff out and I eat animal foods every single day, I eat meat and just animal products, the foods I'm eating is very bioavailable. It's the most nutrient-dense, whole foods, the most bioavailable foods on the planet. And what I put in my body utilizes, and there's very little waste, and it just affects my body so much differently. And I cannot stress that enough. It's just the way it affects my body is just drastically different. So the notion that you can eat whatever you want as long as it fits your macros, and it's just calories in, calories out, and everything in moderation, all that stuff, I think you can see by me telling this story that has not been the case for me. And really what has mattered the most is the food I actually put in my body, the things I consume. That has mattered much more than the amount of food I eat and the amount of calories I consume. And we'll get into calories in just a minute because I do want to share my opinion on that. But let's just talk about who I think this will work for and who this might not work for. So I think for people that come to Carnivore that I guess kind of grew up the same way I did, where you could pretty much eat whatever you wanted and it was kind of hard for you to gain weight, those people will probably be able to eat pretty much as they want without any ramifications, without any risk of gaining, excess body fat. I think that really will be the case for most of those people. But I do think genetics play a role here, because if you've always had a hard time maintaining a healthy body weight and a healthy body composition throughout your entire life, coming to Carnivore and expecting to eat as much as you want is probably not going to work out very good for you. So I think for those people, you probably do need to be kind of mindful about how much you consume and just not overstuff yourself. But I think for most people, it's just as simple as eating when you're hungry and stopping when you're full. But you have to really tap into your intuition and know when that signal hits that says you're full and to stop eating. That way you actually stop eating and you don't overindulge yourself. You don't go too heavy on the food and just, eat because it's convenient or eat because you're bored or snack and stuff like that. I think that's where you would run into a lot of problems. But I think if you can just trust your gut and trust your intuition, even if your genetics aren't set up for you to be very, very lean all the time, you could probably get away with eating whenever you're hungry and eating till satiety. And I think that's probably going to be enough to help you establish and maintain a healthy body composition. Now, the people I think that will really struggle with this and will not be able to eat as much as they want without any ramifications will be people that have some sort of underlying condition that is holding down their metabolic health or their hormone health. All right, so if you've got something going on with your hormones or your metabolic health isn't optimized, I think it'll be really important to get those things resolved before you can get to the point of eating to full satiety without having to worry about picking up excess weight. All right, so based on my story and based on my own personal experience, I'm going to share my thoughts about the calorie. So if you're unfamiliar with where the calorie metric came from, I want to explain that real quick. So between 1819 and 1824, there were a couple scientists that were trying to find a way to measure energy. They were trying to come up with a metric for energy. And in order to do that, they came up with a scientific process where they essentially heated up water and then measured to see how much energy it took to heat 1 kilogram of water 1 degree centigrade. All right. And then what they came up with was where the calorie metric came from. So the calorie itself was originally invented as a metric, just a metric to measure energy. That's all it was invented for. The original intent didn't have anything to do with food. And as a matter of fact, one of the original uses for the calorie was to measure the fuel efficiency of steam engines. All right. It had nothing to do with food whatsoever. So a few years after this, these scientists doing what they do best, they're just tinkering around. They're like, you know what? Let's throw some food down this vat of water and let's heat it up using this same process. And let's see if we can measure the energy potential that this food has. So that's exactly what they did. They put the food in this vat of water. They called this the bomb calometer, and they heated the food up. They measured the energy it took to heat the food, and that's where they came up with the calorie metric for the food. But again, it was a metric to measure energy. So I think it goes without saying that we're not steam engines, all right? And the scientific process they use to determine the amount of energy potential food has nothing to do with the way our body actually assimilates, processes, and digests food. Our body relies on very complex digestive processes, which involves acid, absorption, bacteria, and a bunch of very complex biological processes that scientists admit they don't even fully understand. So that's one of the biggest problems I have with the calorie, is just the fact that it's based off a scientific process that has absolutely nothing to do with how our body digests and processes food. But in addition to that, and to make this even more ludicrous, is that back in the early 1900s, the scientific community actually abandoned the calorie. All right, they completely did away with it. And they found a more efficient and a more accurate way to measure energy, and they came up with the joule. But for some reason, around that same time frame, around World War II, the U.S., doing what they do best, they thought it was in their best interest to adopt the calorie as the standard unit of measurement for food and the energy potential it has when we consume it. Even though the scientific community abandoned it, even though it was based off a scientific process that has nothing to do with the way we digest food, they still decided to use it. And after all these years, which it's been over 200 years now since that thing was originally invented and coined the term, calorie, and was abandoned and all this stuff, nobody's thought to go back and look at that. Nobody's thought to go back to see if there's a better way to do things. And to me, that's an absolute tragedy. It's put all of our focus on the calorie and, to lose weight, consuming less calories. And it's taken our focus off of everything else about food that is important. It's taken our focus off of what's in the food, the nutrient profile of the food, what the food is it processed or is it a whole food, what it's made of, all these things that are so fundamentally important about food, we don't really focus on that. And the big reason for that is because of the calorie, because we're so focused on a metric instead of the actual food itself. And that is very disheartening. And that's it is an absolute tragedy. The fact that we haven't gone back and relooked at that and revisited it to see if there's a better way we can do things, to see if there's a better way that we can measure food. Because I would say that there is. Because when you introduce foods that aren't natural and they have 50, 100 ingredients that aren't natural, when it goes in your body, it's going to affect your body in a different way than if you were eating a steak or an apple. And I think there's too much evidence out there to argue against that. As a matter of fact, I would say that the evidence is all around us when we look at the health of our nation. Because over 70% of the population is overweight or obese, and over 70% of the food that we consume now is hyperprocessed food. And I could almost guarantee that even if we were eating the same amount of calories, but it was coming from different foods, natural whole foods, that you could still consume the same amount of calories and still not have that much of a negative impact on your health. So just imagine if we had this same mindset about everything else in the world. I mean, imagine how much we would be held back right now. Let's just take cars for an example, because that's a very simple way to look at this. If we would have taken this same stance on cars and been like, okay, the first car is invented, it's got 4 wheels and an engine. Granted, you have to get out, you have to stick a rod in the front, and you got to crank start it. And, it only goes 20 miles an hour, and it only gets 2 miles to a gallon, but that's good enough. We don't need to revisit that. We don't need to relook at it. It's fine the way it is. If we would have had that same mindset about everything else in the world, it would have really held us back. So when it comes to everything else in the world, we've adopted the mindset that improving things is better. And if you can come up with a better way to do things, you're being innovative. And it's a smart thing to do. But when it comes to the calorie, something that was invented over 200 years ago, nobody seems to care to go back and relook at that. And that's a really terrible thing. So I think one of the most important things that we can do to improve our health and to improve our relationship with food is to just change our mindset about food. Change the way we think about food. So instead of thinking about food as a metric or in terms of calories, we should really be thinking about food in terms of nutrients. What that food is made of, what is in the food, what ingredients are in there, where it came from, what kind of food it is. Is it a real whole food or is it a hyper-processed food? All these things we should really take into account instead of just focusing on calories, because when you focus on calories, you're leaving out a lot of very important factors that I think are way more important than the term calorie. Because to me, based off my own personal experience and everything I just talked about, calories have been pretty irrelevant. And what has mattered the most is what I'm actually putting in my body. Not how much of it, not what the metrics are when I put it in there, but just the type of foods I focus on. That has made the biggest impact and the biggest difference on my overall health more than anything else. Food is a biological and fundamental requirement that every single one of us needs in order to nourish our bodies. Our bodies are a direct reflection of what we put in it, and the food that we consume, it literally makes us. It's the fuel that grows our cells. It's what makes us into who we are. And without it, we cease to exist. That's the way we should reframe our mind and start thinking about food. And I think the sooner we do that, the sooner we can get our health back. So be sure to leave a comment down below and let me know what you think about this. Share your opinion, share your experience, and I'm very, very curious to know if anybody else has had the same experience as I had. And let me know what your opinion is on the calorie, because I know that's a hot topic for a lot of people, and I know there's a lot of people that's probably going to disagree with me on that, but that's totally fine because I welcome all opinions. And really, I kind of just want to open up the discussion and see what y'all's thoughts are on this and see what your experience has been.